Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Kiran Krishnamurthy, one of the pulmonologists at Apollo Hospitals, Jayanagar, Bangalore. So we are here for another excellent webinar organized by the Chest Council of India today. My sincere thanks to Dr. N.H. Krishna, who called me up and gave me this excellent opportunity to be a moderator on this session, on this pro-con debate that we have for you today. As we know, Dr. N.H. Krishna, Dr. Narayan Pradeepa, Dr. Ravi Dosi, and Dr. Vijay Kumar, and all have been working tirelessly over the last several years to bring us a series of webinars, panel discussions, and masterclass. We've had some eminent speakers bring us this knowledge on this platform, which has made our day-to-day management of patients significantly better and easier with evidence-based medicine. So as we face the second wave of the pandemic, it's time to ponder over what we have learned from the first wave of the pandemic and where we stand in terms of dealing with, some of the issues that we have come up with, particularly the sequelae of COVID-19. Even as our understanding of interstitial lung diseases has increased vastly over the last several years, we're now faced with this new entity called the post-COVID fibrosis. We don't know how it behaves. We don't know how to treat it, when to treat it, and what to treat it with. And most importantly, the question of, do we treat it with antifibrotics or not? So we have two eminent speakers for you today who are going to speak in favor of or against the use of antifibrotics, particularly in the post-COVID fibrosis. So as you know, our speakers today are Professor S.K. Chabra and Dr. Nitin Abhyankar. Both of them really need no introduction. However, I'm going to give you a brief introduction about them. Professor S.K. Chabra, as you know, has been the ex-director of the VP Institute of Chest Medicine in Delhi, and is currently the head of the Department of Pulmonary Sleep and Critical Care Medicine at Prima Super Speciality Hospital, Delhi. He is well known for his pioneering work in the epidemiology, pathogenesis, and pathophysiology of asthma, for his work on air pollution, and in determining the prediction equations for Indians for lung functions. He's been the editor of the Indian Journal of Chest Diseases, and besides that, he's been involved in research projects for scientific bodies like WHO, ICMR, and CSIR. He's delivered more than 250 guest lectures and has more than 150 publications in international journals of repute to his credit. We are in fact privileged to have him here speak to us on this platform today. Professor Chabra will be arguing against the use of antifibrotics in post-COVID pulmonary fibrosis. Our first speaker is Dr. Nitin Abhyankar, who again needs no introduction on this platform. He is the head of the Department of Pulmonary Medicine at Pune Hospital and Research Center, Pune. He is also the founder director of the School of Interventional Pulmonology at Pune Hospital. He is credited with having performed the largest series of medical thoracoscopies, the medical thoracoscopic lung biopsies in India. He's also the course coordinator for respiratory therapy program. And interestingly, he is the first doctor in Pune to have received the Covishield vaccine. Dr. Abhyankar will be speaking in favor of using antifibrotics in post-COVID fibrosis today. We will have a question and answer session at the end of it, and I encourage all of you to please do send us your questions, and we will take as many questions to be answered by our expert speakers today. So let's start the debate. Over to you first, Dr. Abhyankar. Thank you.
Good evening, friends. We are here for this pro and con debate on the role of antifibrotics in post-COVID lung fibrosis. Very frankly, let me confess right at the beginning that what me and what Dr. Chabra are going to speak is going to be about judicious use rather than indiscriminate use. And I hope we come to a same conclusion, because nobody can say that antifibrotics should be given to all patients with post-COVID lung, and nobody can say that no antifibrotic should ever be used in post-COVID lung. So I think both extremes will be wrong, and therefore somewhere we will reach the middle path, and that is what I'm confident about. So let's start understanding the gravity of the situation. A huge number of cases all over the world with nearly 30 lakh people have died over the last 1 year or so. We are seeing nearly 2 lakh cases in this country, around 60 to 70,000 cases in Maharashtra alone every day. And that figures are maybe going up in the last week or so. There's an alarming number of deaths, and now they are touching 1,80,000 to be precise. This was 5th April, and today it is 15th. So another, say, about 28,000 cases has been added. So a lot of people are dying. And what it means is that the lung involvement in large number of these patients is severe. I'm sure when we look at COVID pneumonia, we talk of these alveolitic kind of shadows, which are ground glass opacifications. And that's a typical hallmark of an early COVID pneumonia or an early COVID lung involvement. I'm sure nobody is going to give antifibrotics in this particular entity, but as you go down the line, things starts getting worse. So in the acute or chronic inflammatory phases, what you see is the dominant alveolitic kind of pattern. And this is the pattern which is very much associated with alveolar epithelial damage, which eventually leads to overexpression of pro-inflammatory cytokines, TGF-beta, TNF-alpha, and IL-6. And then the fibroblast and myofibroblast starts getting activated. And then because of these fibroblast and myofibroblast, over a period of time, what looks like this ground glass starts looking like honeycombs or traction bronchiectasis, which is visible in these shadows. So this is because of the excessive deposition of collagen in the extracellular matrix. Let me once again reiterate, and I think probably I'll keep reiterating every time, that not everybody who starts like this will end up like this. Not everybody who looks like this in the beginning will end up with this kind of shadows. But some of these patients have the potential, and we have the job and responsibility of finding out who are they. And when we find such a patient, it must be given an antifibrotic. So let's once again try and understand at the pathophysiological level. It's the ACE2 receptors which are at the center. The level goes down. The angiotensin 2 levels keep going up. The TGF-beta levels going up, and this is believed to be a profibrotic. Because of the joint action of TGF-beta as well as angiotensin 2, eventually both myofibroblastic activation and extracellular matrix accumulation takes place. Add to that, somebody is given excessive oxygen, then the hyperoxia comes in. Somebody is needing high FiO2, then that hyperoxia effect will add it. And sometimes people who are mechanically ventilated, ventilator-associated lung injury also will add to the lung fibrosis. So by the innate action of the virus, the action of the oxygen, and the oxygen of ventilator-associated all are likely lead to a situation of a lung fibrosis in post-COVID lungs. There is a unique nature of the lung involvement in COVID-19, and the early analysis of patients with COVID-19 have, on hospital discharge, have suggested that a third of the recovered patients have developed fibrotic abnormalities. It doesn't mean they have developed advanced fibrosis, but they have seen some fibrosis. The pathological feature of ARDS in the early phase is diffuse alveolar damage, which is initially an acute inflammatory exudate phase with hyaline membrane formation, and then followed later on by an organizing phase and a fibrotic phase. And you will have to separate these three radiological patterns in your mind if you need to find out which patients will qualify for an antifibrotic. It has been seen that if the disease duration is just less than a week, only 4% people land up with a lung fibrosis, whereas if the disease duration is more than 3 weeks, as high as 61% of the patients will land up with a lung fibrosis. And therefore, this fact also needs to be kept in mind when you are choosing your patients carefully for this. ARDS in general, various viruses, acute respiratory distress syndrome, is believed to be the main predictor for pulmonary fibrosis, but several studies have shown that COVID-induced ARDS is a different disease. There are some cases which are high elastance and some with a low elastance. And the low elastance ones which similarly simulate the classical ARDS, but the high elastance ones in the early phase are different. CT findings in many COVID cases may not suggest classical ARDS, and you will almost certainly not see the basal predominance in most of these cases. Abnormal coagulopathy is another unique pathological feature of this disease, and that needs to be addressed both in the diagnostic algorithm and in the treatment features when we are dealing with this. So, in a nutshell, mechanism of pulmonary fibrosis in COVID-19 is different from that which is classical IPF and other fibrotic lung diseases. And I would rather call it a resolving lung fibrosis rather than a progressive lung fibrosis. So one has to be careful when we are doling out antifibrotics to them. So I am actually speaking for Dr. Chabra right now, but I think that's the right way of going ahead. Particularly when we deal with the pathological findings pointing to alveolar epithelial cells as the injury site rather than not the endothelial cells, like as we see in systemic sclerosis related damage. So that is where the endothelial sites are more, whereas here it is the alveolar epithelial sites is the more. So as I already pointed out, majority of the patients will follow this course, which is progressive improvement. And by the end of 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, at the most 2 months, they would be nearly normal. Some of them will be static and some of them will be the ones who are progressing. If it is a mild and a static process, again, I would not really prescribe antifibrotics, but the ones which are a bad disease and remaining static and the ones which are progressive should be considered for antifibrotics in these patients. And the incidence varies from as low as 25 to as high as 62 for various studies. I'm sure you people have read Dr. Wadia's very beautiful case of post-COVID lung fibrosis where they had used nintedanib in one of the early phases. So this is one example. Now, one more study showed that the lung lesions of nearly 2/3 of these patients were fully absorbed by 4-week follow-up. It indicated that the damage to the lung tissue by COVID-19 could be reversible for common COVID-19 patients, majority of them. It also suggested that the prognosis of non-severe patients is favorable and the clinical intervention should be conducted in time to prevent COVID-19 patients from worsening to severe patients. So just the act of timely putting them on, if you want me, on the adequate oxygen support, steroids given in right doses, anti-inflammatory agents chosen correctly, and this debatably remdesivir. I really don't believe that would really have an impact, but debatably remdesivir also may be considered. So timely intervention of treating mild moderate patients well may prevent patients from developing, and therefore you might prevent long-term fibrosis. Now, there have been certain shadows which are associated with good prognosis and certain ones which are associated with bad prognosis. And we need to sort this out in our mind. If I see pure ground glass appearance in the initial phase, then the chance of me getting into a bad lung fibrosis is less comparatively. But if I start seeing ground glass with consolidation, then the chance of me getting late fibrotic process is higher. Similarly, if I see a pure consolidation, particularly an organizing consolidation, I'm going to get worse over a period of time. So it is worth keeping in mind. If I see interstitial lung disease, once again, it is very likely to be responsive. But if I see, say, crazy paving, air bronchograms, once again, the chance of them getting into severe disease is less. But if I see an irregular interface, or if I see a coarse reticular pattern, so look at interstitial thickening, look for irregular interface, look for a coarse reticular pattern, and look for parenchymal bands. These are the 4 prognostic predicators for a bad long-term evolution of fibrosis. So if I see these kind of shadows and these kind of shadows, not in a small percentage, but a large number of areas, then I would be cautious in looking for antifibrotics in this. If you go back into the pathophysiology a little bit, chronic repetitive injury typically leads to alveolar epithelial injury is the starting process, and a chronic repetitive injury leading to fibroblast migration, fibroblast proliferation, accumulation of myofibroblast, collagen deposition, and lung fibrosis. This is the way a typical fibrosis goes through. And SCC related, say systemic sclerosis related, it will mediate through epithelial, but the acute COVID related injury goes through the alveolar epithelial pathway. Only thing is the rapidity with which this happens is very fast, and therefore the timing of the antifibrotics is going to be crucial. The antifibrotics will work at the migration proliferation phase, everywhere, collagen deposition phase, in all, and even in the progression. At all stages, it will work. But at the same time, it's not going to be working if I wait too long. And that's something which is very, very important to keep in mind while we progress on it. And let's take a few case examples to understand this whole phenomenon better. Here is a 60-year-old gentleman, known pre-diabetic, presented with a dry cough for 3 months, had dyspnea on exertion. Chest X-ray showed discrete airspace consolidation areas with bilateral lower and mid zones. And then you can appreciate that the HRCT is showing bilateral lateral septal thickening, the traction bronchiectasis, which is visible in these areas, and scattered reticular and ground glass infiltration, which is seen in these areas. And these are essentially in the lower fields. Now, this patient eventually was, treated with what is not really relevant, but the idea is you can look for these clues and you will probably get early indication that this person is going to land into a MAC fibrosis. I'll take one more case, and this is again a case which is published in 2021 in the respirology case reports. A 78-year-old Japanese woman with no smoking history suffered from COVID-19 related ARDS, required multidisciplinary management. ICU mechanical ventilation was involved. Treated initially with a combination therapy of typical remdesivir, dexamethasone, heparin, with no beneficial effect on the respiratory failure. 14 days after the tracheal intubation, the respiratory condition kept worsening. You can appreciate why it is worsening. You can appreciate that there is a substantial amount of fibrosis. Eventually, and of course, there is an adequate amount of ground glassing also. Subsequently, a larger dose of nitapropisolam at the dose of 80 milligrams per day gradually improved her respiratory condition such that she was extubated on day 28. On the day 12 after the transfer, that is nearly 65 days after the initiation of mechanical ventilation, the patient was then started on oral treatment of nintedanib at a dose of 300 milligrams per day. I wonder whether we should be waiting this long, but this trend of traction bronchiectasis, which is visible on, for example, I think this is also very, very long. I wait this long, but end of second week is possibly the time when I can see these kind of patterns emerging in some patients. And when they are in substantial number, I would treat them early on. Now, this patient, when in the follow-up, demonstrated a restrictive ventilator defect. The vital capacity was just as low as 1.2 liters after 6 weeks. 3 months of treatment with nintedanib and a continuation of 10 milligrams of prednisolone. So we are not exclusively saying only use an antifibrotic, a low-dose steroid, and then the exercise tolerance and respiratory condition of the patient keep improving. And you can appreciate, we can just go back to one slide, and this is the amount of fibrosis which was there in the initial phase. It reduced a little bit when the patient was put on antifibrotic, and then eventually antifibrotics and a low-dose steroid considerably better. The ground glass appearance went on reducing, and further progression of the fibrosis did not occur. So what I'm trying to hint at is a ground glass essentially is a product of alveolitis, which will be amenable to treatment with steroids, whereas the antifibrotic will work on stopping the progression of the fibrosis. So that's where the antifibrotic will work. We take one more case, which is again presented in European Respiratory Society Journal. A 38-year-old man presented with 6-day history of gradually worsening and asthenia and secondary anosmia and esophageal, and had no prior personal medical history on admission. young man. Admission in the emergency room, clinical examination revealed crackles in the right lung, tachypnea, respiratory rate of 40 per minute, tachycardia, pulse rate of 119, oxygen saturation of 66%. So a bad patient to start with. Initial CTPA showed bilateral CT and CTPA, groundmass abnormalities, condensation in the right lower lobe, and no sign of pulmonary embolism. Nasal swab, of course, was positive. So this is how we went on. This is the initial CT, and this was the initial CT in comparison to the, and this is the upper and this is the lower lobe. You can appreciate the kind of alveolar densities or alveolitis which is in this area, but you can also appreciate a hint of traction bronchiectasis emerging, and it becomes much more apparent as you progress. So this patient went on to into the ICU, oxygen therapy, high flow nasal cannula, so on and so forth. The treatment included daily high dose of initial IV steroids, 250 milligram for the first 3 days, and 1 mg per kg per day of nintedanib. And this patient, as I would agree, was rightly put on antifibrotic therapy early on. Now, I'm not exactly sure on which day. In my mind, it is towards the end of second week of the disease, where if I see these kind of shadows, I'm going to put this patient on an antifibrotic in addition to the steroids. And then the patient's condition improved over a period of time and went into the ward on oxygen therapy and did better. So steroids, most patients will develop a post-COVID interstitial lung disease hypoxic. And after the result of recovery trial that announced on June 16, the steroid became the standard of care in almost all patients of hypoxia, patients in ICUs across the world, and even in the post-ICU scenarios, a smaller dose gets continued. Rationale for antifibrotics, both COVID and IPF share main common demographic factors, disproportionately affecting males, elderly, and smokers. These drugs are believed to be useful in patients with acute exacerbation of ILD. So even in an acute scenario, both IPF and other fibrotic ILDs, they are useful. So there is a logical idea of putting them on antifibrotics. Fibrosis and with fibroblast and honeycombing has clearly been demonstrated in autopsies and explanted lungs of patients with SARS-CoV. For these reasons, it is reasonable to assume that the fibrotic drugs may be potentially valuable, having a potentially valuable role in these kind of settings. There's a little bit of this is not a publication, but this comes from my city, and this is the Army Hospital experience. And they had put people on ventilator, 4 patients on nintedanib, and the patients did well. This is just in brief what kind of trials right now are going. And there are 2 trials, this CDC, this one and this phase 3 trial, where pirfenidone and nintedanib are getting studied. This particular trial is not yet initiated, but these 2 trials are recruiting. So there is a lot of research going on in the roles of antifibrotics. So one can be skeptical. I am skeptical whether remdesivir will works or not, but I feel that an antifibrotic is much less harmful than and much less expensive than a remdesivir kind of a thing ongoing. So I'll come to the summary in the end, and I'll show you one case which is very interesting from my collections. This patient had COVID somewhere in September 2020. He was seen by a doctor in Amravati after his post-COVID scenario, and he was labeled as post-COVID fibrosis. He had a stable saturation when the doctor saw him at 93-94%. He was put on fibrodone 80 milligrams, nintedanib 801 milligrams thrice daily, and nintedanib 150 twice daily. So he was on dual therapy for whatever reason. And then another comment that he had made is to stop tablet Medrol, and that was also something which I agreed to when I saw the patient. So I saw this patient actually a little later, somewhere around 7/1/2021, and patient was stabilized on steroids and antifibrotics. And I thought that now this patient possibly does not need oxygen anymore. So the nintedanib was continued. I thought of giving only 1 antifibrotics rather than 2, get his full lung functions done, evaluate them properly. He was on trimium, and I for what reasons. And this is the CT, and I'm sure most of you will agree that you are seeing lots and lots of fibrotic bands. Some of you will appreciate some amount of honeycombing, and I'm sure you will appreciate some amount of traction bronchiectasis also. So that's the kind of scenario that we are looking at here. I'm sure that you are not really able to appreciate that much of ground glassing which is left. And this is the scan when I saw this particular patient. And therefore, rightly, as the previous doctor was also saying, that I thought that I did not really continue this patient on steroids, so I tried to stay for them. This was his lung function. He had moderate restriction on a basic spirometry. He had a significantly impaired total lung capacity, just around 44%, strongly favoring a fibrotic process, and he had a grossly low, significantly impaired this diffusion study. So just around 26% of single lung history. He was significantly desaturated walking, though his baseline saturation was 93. Though his 6-minute walk distance was not all that bad, it was of 77% of the predicted, but his lowest saturation was 78%. And this actually thought that I should not withdraw the steroids. So I continued on 12 milligrams, which will be 10 milligram equivalent of prednisolone, nintedanib, and Trimium was continued. And why Trimium was continued? Because of one small observation of a slight change in the FEV1 here and the possible role of cyclosinide in the post-COVID kind of a scenario. So we will go ahead. And then a month later, I started tapering the steroids and it got stopped in the next 15 days or so. But the patient came back within a month's time and I had to practically double the steroid back again. Then nintedanib was continued all throughout, the Trimium was continued all throughout. And again, his oxygen dependence, which had reappeared, he was needing 4 to 5 liters of oxygen, just was unable to walk any further, again, responded to the steroids. So continuation of steroids is an important decision, or I would say as important a decision as continuing with nintedanib. And over the last 2 months, so from 25 to I started tapering the steroids back again in a very slow manner. And now over the 2 months, I have seen him just yesterday, and now I have still continued tapering the steroids and another 1.5 months. So nearly 6 months from the onset, this person is on deflazacort in a reducing dose. He's on nintedanib, he's on Trimium for whatever reason. But I think his main pathology is post-COVID fibrosis, and he definitely deserves steroids with that kind of a lung function. He will be repeating all his lung functions very soon. We are at this point in time following close to around 40 such patients, and majority of them require steroids for anywhere between 1 to 1.5 months. And then they are off steroids. And then almost all of them are continued on nintedanib, which at this point in time remains my preferred antifibrotic for anywhere between 3 to 9 months. That is what is expected. We have to look at, of course, the risk-benefit ratio when we are using steroids, definitely, particularly say in a diabetic or somebody is getting harmed, somebody is picking up secondary infections. But in some patients, prolonged low-dose corticosteroids may prevent remodeling in long-term lung survivors. And this is being presented in European Journal of Preventive Cardiology in 2020. One more study which comes from this Italian one, April 20 to May 20, is assessed persistent symptoms in 143 patients who were discharged from the hospital after recovery from COVID-19. The patients were assessed at a mean of around 2 months after the initial onset of COVID-19, and just around 18% were completely free from any COVID-19 related symptoms, while 32% patients had 1 to 2 symptoms and 55% had 3 or more. And if you look at the symptoms, what are these symptoms? Fatigue, dyspnea, joint pains. I'm not really seeing that much of joint pain, and chest pain. But 3 of these are related to lung fibrosis in one way or the other. And I'm going to argue that I would look for lung fibrosis in these patients in a careful way. I'm not saying everybody will go on it, but some of them will go on it. Many studies have shown that the commonest abnormality in the lung function, and I think we have seen it in both of these, are impaired diffusion capacity, which was 26% in my patient, which I showed you, and a significant restriction, moderate to severe restriction, was seen, both associated with the severity of the disease. Both decreased alveolar volume and KCO will contribute to the pathogenesis of impaired diffusion. So diffusion may not be entirely a product of related to only the alveolitis, but also the decreased alveolar volume per se, and therefore fibrosis also will reflect on a reduced DHO over a period of time. At the 3 months of discharge, residual abnormalities of pulmonary functions were observed in nearly 1/3 of the patients, as shown by one of the studies, and this cohort which was lower than the abnormal function in COVID-19 patients when discharged. And lung function abnormalities were detected in 14 out of 55 patients. And they also, this was another study by Nasser, where they showed that D-dimer levels at admission may be useful in prediction of impaired diffusion defect. I'm sure you people have read about LDH also as a marker. I'm not too sure about the markers at this point in time, but I would rather look at the patient behavior, the values, and the follow-up data. I think that is going to be very important.
We are discussing the use of antifibrotics in post-COVID pulmonary fibrosis. And you just heard Dr. Nitin Abhyankar speak in favor of use of post-COVID pulmonary fibrosis. Now, the format of our debate is such that these are pre-recorded. So, while I am speaking against the concept, I really don't know what forward in support. So I won't be directly contradicting or arguing against his arguments. I'll present my viewpoint. So this is a very important area, and there's an ongoing debate on whether we should be using antifibrotics or not. Before I go further, let me give a background about the talk. Now, chronic fibrotic lung disease, the progressive variety where the fibrosis increases progressively with time, has multiple diseases within this umbrella. The prototype is idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and now the other interstitial lung diseases which with time show progressive fibrosis phenotype. So they are also included within this umbrella. So 2 therapies have been approved for this group of diseases, pirfenidone and nintedanib. And there's a lot of focus on new antifibrotic therapies. And these drugs clearly have a favorable impact on lung function decline over time. That is, these do not improve lung function. They only retard the decline in lung function. So the person is expected to live longer. COVID-19 is an enigmatic and a multifaceted disease and potentially devastating. Just 1 year old, it caught medical science off guard in the year 2020. When it struck, we really did not know about its pathogenesis, pathology, manifestations, and how to treat. New and repurposed drugs were introduced, tried. Few have emerged as effective, and lots of these have been given. The lung pathology in COVID-19 has been studied and can be quite diverse. It affects multiple parts of the lung, affects the interstitium, the distal pulmonary vasculature, the alveoli, the peribronchial tissue. Large airways are largely spared. Significant lung fibrosis has also been found in few patients, and this has predominantly been found in autopsy studies. The interest in antifibrotics has arisen largely because among the different radiological patterns, there is a pattern where there is a stark resemblance to an interstitial lung disease. It resembles an IL. So that is why it has evoked interest in antifibrotic therapy. So there is great enthusiasm in studying antifibrotic therapy. Clinical trials are underway. with currently approved antifibrotics. There are already trials which are registered in the clinical registry, and that is also the reason why we are debating this today. When the disease started, we really did not know how to deal with this. So the initial information came from sources which normally we do not rely upon in medicine. It came from social media, from case reports, from personal experiences, and non-peer reviewed observations. Now, since then, we have gained a lot of information, and now we are moving towards an evidence-based management of COVID-19 patients. Regularly updated guidelines are now available from different sources in India and abroad, from NIH, ERS, the Government of India, and different states. So now that evidence-based protocols, or at least standardized protocols, are available, the scope for liberties, that is treating COVID the way one wants, this must be limited, and evidence-based medicine needs to be restored. So we should be logical, talk with a scientific rationale whenever we propose a therapy. So antifibrotics, what is the current status? The currently approved treatments for COVID-19 largely focus on the acute picture. Longitudinal studies are few, but it has been documented with short-term follow-ups. Because the disease is only 1 year old, so maximum we could follow up for a year or so. And studies have shown that there are residual abnormalities on lung function and CT. That is, the disease doesn't apparently go away that quickly and leaves some bit of damage on lung function, and the CT remains abnormal. So what are the long-term consequences? Do we need antifibrotics to prevent apparent progress of the disease? So far, there is no evidence that the disease is progressive. In fact, majority of patients tend to improve with time. So the worst is during the acute phase. After that, when we follow up these patients, lung function starts to improve slowly. The radiological picture starts to improve. So the abnormalities which are persistent after 3 or 6 months, they are less than what was there immediately after the disease started. So the disease is not progressive. So in all the guidelines that we have so far, antifibrotics have not been approved anywhere in the world. However, in India and even in other countries, physicians have jumped the gun. We see so many prescriptions where on discharge, patients with residual abnormalities are prescribed antifibrotics without any clear objective as to how long these are going to continue, why these have been given. And this has been facilitated by the availability of the Indian limited and subtle promotion has expedited the issues. So from October last year, there have been several webinars, and the use of antifibrotic, especially in nintedanib, in post-COVID lung has increased. Although evidence is not at all, there's not a single study which has been shown that there is any beneficial effect by using antifibrotics in post-COVID state. But unfortunately, as has been happening in COVID, there is a plethora of regimes. People treat COVID the way they want, and we don't seem inclined to wait for evidence. These are some of the studies which are registered. Results are not yet out, but clinical use is rampant. Now, whether this is justified or not, we don't have much to answer with respect to COVID. However, if you look at similar problems, related diseases, then that provides interesting information. ARDS is one of the most devastating consequences of COVID-19. Its stages have been well studied. It has initial exudative and inflammatory phase, then there is a fibroproliferative stage, and in patients who have poor prognosis, there is a lot of fibrosis. In fact, patients with fibrosis are more often diagnosed post-mortem or autopsy studies. Those who survive, they don't have much fibrosis. There have been several studies on long-term consequences of ARDS of diverse etiology. Lung function has been shown to be mildly reduced in some patients at 6 months. There has been abnormalities on chest imaging at 6 months follow-up. Majority of studies have found that the lung function studies tend to restore towards normalcy. That is, the spirometry results by 6 months to 1 year would approximate the normal values. The 6-month walk test, 6-minute walk test also approaches normal values. The CT findings are minor, basically non-dependent pulmonary fibrotic changes. There are other features like exercise limitation, physical and psychological sequelae, but the objective damage that one can find out by doing spirometry and by imaging, that seems to be limited, and there is a tendency to improve. So any ARDS, irrespective of diverse etiology that can cause it, has a tendency to improve. So ARDS is not leading to progressive fibrosis. In specific cause ARDS related to influenza, similar observations have been made. That is, the spirometric abnormalities and the radiological abnormalities are quite inconsequentially clinically, although one can find subtle changes on imaging and there can be little bit of impairment of lung function, but clinically these are not useful. And most importantly, the lung function invariably improves over time. The coronavirus, which is now the scourge of the world, this is not the first inflammatory disease of the lungs that it has caused. This is coronavirus 2. The earlier syndromes, severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, that struck between 2002 to 2004, and the MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, these were associated with high mortality due to ARDS and multi-organ system failure. There also, similar changes were observed with these infections, which we are observing today in COVID-19. And there also it has been found that on follow-up, the abnormalities have been mild. There is a tendency for improvement, and restoration of lung function is the norm rather than the exception. So majority of patients will be left with mild impairment or no impairment after a few months in MERS and SARS. So this has been well documented with studies with a longitudinal follow-up of up to 5 years or so. In fact, one study with SARS survivors for 15 years, the pulmonary interstitial damage and the functional decline mostly recovered within 2 years of rehabilitation. Majority of patients have shown improvement on CT scan. So these inflammatory diseases do not seem to cause a progressive lung damage. So this is the summary of some of the studies which I have covered, that although there may be a decreased quality of life and exercise capacity in some patients, the pulmonary function abnormalities, the spirometry and diffusion capacity changes, these are mostly mild and recover with time, returning to normal in most patients. CT does show residual damage in the form of interstitial thickening or traction bronchiectasis, but these changes are static or improve, and certainly are non-progressive. So therefore, we have never really introduced antifibrotics as a therapy in ARDS. There have been no studies in ARDS because the need has not been felt. The fibrotic changes in ARDS tend to limit themselves, and there is invariably improvement with time. So there has never been a felt need for antifibrotics in ARDS. COVID-19 lung has been studied longitudinally in some studies. And as I said earlier, after recovery from the acute phase, there is documented abnormality in lung function, either spirometry or diffusion capacity in these studies. And radiologically also, CT changes are there in the form of ground glass infiltrates, architectural distortion, and linear bands. Autopsy studies have shown that fibrotic changes in COVID-19 are not that common as we tend to believe. Largely, it's a diffuse alveolar damage. And a novel finding in COVID-19 lung is the involvement of pulmonary vasculature with microthrombi and endotheliitis. And it is believed that the linear shadows that we see in a CT image, which we liken it to a fibrotic involvement, may actually represent a vascular microthrombosis. So fibrosis as such is not a very common phenomenon in ARDS in post-COVID lung, and has largely been seen in those patients who did not survive. So it is a marker of poor prognosis. Diffuse alveolar damage and microvascular damage, these are the predominant pathological findings in COVID-19. The fibrotic pattern is seen only in a minority of patients. So we have to see this picture of the pathological changes in the clinical context. Apparently, the fibrosis which is occurring in the most severe COVID-19 patients differs from the fibrosis that we see in chronic interstitial lung disease. The fibrosing phenotype of chronic interstitial lung diseases and in the IPF. The timing, the etiology, the prognosis, and the mechanism, these are different. These diseases where antifibrotics are now well established, these are progressive fibrosing diseases. Whereas in COVID-19 lung, there is little evidence that the disease is progressive. The apparent fibrotic changes, and a lot of these so-called fibrotic changes that we see on a chest X-ray may not actually represent histological fibrosis. So this tends to resolve with time. And this resolution with time, improvement, is a feature which is never seen in IP, never seen in progressive fibrosing IIT. So these two diseases where antifibrotics are now well established, they have a totally different natural history from COVID-19. We need to study COVID-19 more, need to have longitudinal studies extending into a few years. The current evidence which shows that it is not progressive has been from studies which have covered 6 months or 9 months. So till now, the key treatment in all guidelines is antiviral therapy and anti-inflammatory therapy and to reduce the prothrombotic state. No guideline published anywhere in the world has so far indicated that lung fibrosis also needs to be treated prophylactically with antifibrotics. So antifibrotics do not figure in any of the guidelines. Now these are some of the examples which I am showing from my own collection, which are self-explanatory. So if we ask the question, in patients with COVID-19 who are recovering, are antifibrotics necessary. Now, in this patient, if we look at the left panels, the upper two are the uppercuts. The left one is during the active stage of COVID-19, and the right one is on recovery. And the lower cuts show the lower zones. Now, this kind of picture, one would even start thinking, if it was not a COVID case, as a classical sarcoidosis. But if you look at the CT, which is done about 1.5 months later, this stark resolution. Now, this kind of resolution, we never seen any kind of interstitial lung disease. So all these white linear shadows, did they really represent fibrosis? Because the patient has recovered remarkably and now is clinically perfectly fine. So this fibrosis, the so-called fibrosis, recovered with time, and the lung has only a few residual scars. So from an extensive apparent fibrosis to an almost normal lung. Another patient, extensive apparently alveolar and interstitial shadows in the left panel, and in the right panel, which is a CT done about 1.5 months later, there's almost total clearing with a few ground glass opacifications and a few residual scars left. So again, this is a spontaneous recovery, nothing given to the patient. The patient received treatment only during the acute phase, and after that, there was pulmonary rehabilitation and oxygen given for some time, and some supportive therapy. Even the steroids were tapered off. So the disease has a very strong tendency to improve on its own. It does not progress. Now, this patient was a very severe patient. He had ARDS, took about 6 weeks to come after respiratory failure. And the CT done on the right side, the first one on the left is in June, and the one on the right side is in August. So again, there is a substantial resolution of the consolidations. There are residual scars. The patient has clinically improved. The hypoxemia has gone. So apparently, the disease is not progressive. And after this, there is no follow-up available. And I presume the patient became asymptomatic. So again, spontaneous recovery, not requiring any kind of treatment except supportive treatment. Then there are other radiological manifestations where improvement is the rule. A common pattern is ground glass opacities. Now, most of these opacities would dissolve with time, so they will not lead to any kind of linear shadows. Small consolidation, especially with organizing pneumonia kind of picture, this again has a very favorable prognosis, and this disappears without a trace, as shown in this example. The one on the left shows patchy consolidations during the active phase of the disease, and the panel on the right shows that these have largely resolved. Another example of an organic pneumonia because of COVID-19, it has disappeared without a trace, no fibrosis. Invariably, the lung improves. So that is the picture. And the lung function studies that we have done at 1 month and 3 months have consistently shown that the vital capacity at 3 months is always better than the vital capacity at 1 month. Most of the patients who were on oxygen for a few weeks after recovering from COVID, they have gone off oxygen. So a disease which causes intense damage also has a favorable long-term outcome. So if the patient survives the acute phase, then recovery is the rule. How much residual damage will remain? For this, we need long-term studies. And like in ARDS, some patients may be left with minor degree of abnormalities or small residual scars, which are clinically not significant. So probably this is a one-time damage which is occurring in COVID-19, and the body responds by forming scars. However, am I writing off antifibrotics? No, we need to have an open mind in science. And I do anticipate a few situations where antifibrotics may be necessary. On this patient, on the left, upper and the lower cuts, that shows the classical CORAD 5 picture. So this patient had COVID-19, recovered, and had a normal saturation. And the picture on the right, the upper lobe and in the lower lobe, this has a strong resemblance to a probable UIP pattern. Now, whether this is a healing phase and the improvement will continue, this we will know only on long-term follow-up. But viruses are well known to act as triggers for diseases. Many diabetics, they develop diabetes after there is a viral infection in the pancreas. So viruses are notorious for being triggers. They can put the switches on for diseases. So whether they can act as a trigger for a de novo ILD is not known. We know that COVID-19 lung improves, but whether de novo ILD will start and then that will progress, we have no answer to this question. But if an ILD is triggered off, then definitely antifibrotics would need to be considered. The other aspect which we saw in one patient, now this patient had a non-specific interstitial pneumonia. He developed COVID. So on the left side, on a background of non-specific interstitial pneumonia, there are few ground loss of precipitation. So COVID in this patient was mild, as it tends to be. In most patients who have chronic lung disease, fortunately COVID tends to be mild. Although that may not always be true, but mostly these patients are mild. So in the right panel, the fibrotic markings are somewhat more than what they were in the pre-COVID state. So that raises a question: can COVID-19 act as a trigger for a progressive fibrosis? That is an ILD where the fibrosis was not progressive, that it was not the progressive fibrosing phenotype. Can a virus like COVID-19 convert that into a progressive fibrosing ILD? So if on follow-up, the imaging shows apparent worsening in a pre-existing ILD, lung function starts to deteriorate, then we can certainly say that COVID-19 acted as a trigger and set the patient into a progressive fibrosing phenotype. So again, we need studies on natural history of ILD patients who have been affected by COVID-19, whether COVID-19 worsens their prognosis in ILD. Till now, we have no answer. So impact on pre-existing ILD is one area where antifibrotics may have some place, which needs to be documented. So at present, I would say there is no indication for antifibrotics in a post-COVID fibrotic lung. The currently approved antifibrotics are meant for progressive fibrosing chronic disease management. Now, fibrosing and fibrosis, these are two terms which apparently look similar, but they are not. Fibrosis is a one-time damage like we have in tuberculosis. Fibrosing means a continuous process where active fibrogenesis keeps occurring after recovery, which characterizes idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis and the progressive fibrosing phenotype of ILDs. So these drugs, these are not designed as prophylactics. We cannot use antifibrotics to prevent fibrosis. It is not their property. And these are not meant to reverse established fibrosis. So if a patient of COVID-19 has apparent fibrotic changes, there is no rationale in giving antifibrotics with the hope that the established fibrosis will revert back. There is insufficient rationale to treat post-COVID lung fibrosis. It is not progressive. It tends to improve with time. These are perhaps the biggest arguments in rushing into using antifibrotics in COVID-19 fibrosis. And then post-COVID fibrosis is not universal. The radiological manifestations of COVID-19 are diverse. And it is only the ARDS pattern which would lead to residual CT abnormalities, which again would improve. And this affects only a small fraction of patients. The Book pattern, the subpleural bands, the ground glass opacifications, these are very favorable radiological abnormalities. So, is there any role for antifibrotics? In the standard case of post-COVID lung, there is no indication. But if the lung shows progressive changes, and that will require follow-up. So that means that patients who have got COVID and are worsening later on, they must be followed up and investigated. And these are very few in number. If progressive fibrosis can be documented, or in patients with pre-existing fibrosis, if worsening can be documented, certainly one can consider antifibrotics. So I'll stop here and look forward to questions. Thank you very much.
So, I'm going to take on the second half right now in the recording, and I'm sure you will play it separately. So, as my esteemed colleague has and dear sir, Dr. Chabra has already argued against use of antifibrotics. But let me once again reiterate that there is enough postmortem data and enough explanted specimens from all over the world, including at least 10 from this country, which have shown and documented extensive fibrosis in COVID lungs, which have been either explanted or patients who have died. So whenever there is a post-mortem study available, you have enough data to convince yourself that there is fibrosis. Whether an antifibrotic drug will work or not, of course, it will not work on these dead patients. It has to be given much earlier. So that is the argument. You have to identify this as a separate disease entity. This is not IPF, where I will say, I'll watch this for 3 months. I'll make sure that everything is really fitting my perfect picture. I'm seeing 10% of decline, and then I'm going to put my patient on antifibrotics. No, this is an acute, rapid involvement by a disease which is started within hours, finished within a matter of 1.5 weeks at the most. And the recovery is what is slow over the next few months. And therefore, if I am going to treat, I must treat these patients early rather than late. So I think that is very, very important to understand. You can't just wait for 3 months. That's going to be absolutely silly to start thinking about an antifibrotic after 3 months. So if I have to think about it, I have to think early. How early? I obviously can't give somebody with a viral fever antifibrotic. It doesn't make sense. So the first week belongs to the virus. Second week belongs to COVID pneumonia, and the COVID related pneumonia will start giving you hints. So by the end of second weeks, you should be ready that yes, this particular patient is showing not pure alveolitis, but involvement of either there is an organizing pneumonia, dense organizing consolidations, or an early UIP pattern in terms of honeycombing, traction bronchiectasis, or emerging large number of large irregular bands. If all this is there, then I think you should be putting these patients early on, and do not wait for too long, because it is going to be killing more patients or making more respiratory cripples over a period of time, just because I wanted proof of the concept. I wouldn't want that. I'm going to follow these patients. I'm not going to ignore. Once they stabilize, once I start getting a stable FVC over next 2 or 3 months, I'm going to consider stopping antifibrotics And if the patient has reached a very stable state, surely at the end of 3 or 6 or 9 months, whatever that time is, we will be stopping it. I am not assuming a very, very, very tiny percent of these patients may actually go on to a long-term kind of antifibrotics, but many of them will qualify for at least a good 3 to 6 to 9 months use of antifibrotics. What we have available which will interfere with lung fibrosis, I am really not convinced about antiviral agents, but somebody can get convinced, and definitely a lot of people are using it. So I'm not against the flow at this point in time. I simply don't believe that they really have a role in preventing long-term fibrosis. Anti-inflammatory therapy, we are convinced. Everybody is convinced. Everybody is using enough steroids. Some of us are using tocilizumab. We have just started using, I can't produce it properly as yet, unfamiliar with it, and some of them very rarely have used tocilizumab. But anti-inflammatory agents will have some role to play if used in good time and with a good sense, and that. But antifibrotic drugs, when you sense that there is a fibrosis emerging, that is the time to put it on. When to stop will depend on the clinical stability, the lung function stability, and the radiological stability or improvement, whichever happens earlier and stability reaches. Antifibrotic therapy is possibly the least harmful of all the experimental therapy that we are loading onto our patients. For example, tocilizumab in short use, so we are experimenting with tocilizumab. We don't know whether remdesivir really causes any antifibrotic activity, but that is being given universally, practically to every moderate or severe disease. In any case, somebody gets an hypoxia, he qualifies for remdesivir. So we are doing that. Steroids we are doing. Large dose, people have done all kind of dosing of steroids. Pulse steroids has been used. So if I have to look at one of the least harmful therapies, this possibly is the least. Right? It doesn't mean that it should be given to everybody. Surely not. That is not my argument at all. It must be carefully chosen. It should be preferably done by pulmonologists. I'm not going to recommend this to somebody who doesn't understand lung function, who doesn't understand DLCO, who doesn't understand what is residual volume and what is lung fibrosis. I don't think that is the right way. So this should be done by pulmonologists and should be left to pulmonologists, but in their hands and in their well-trained brains, antifibrotic therapy will remain the least harmful of all the experimental therapies that is there. There is some support to this from Dr. Raghu's writing on antifibrotic drugs such as pirfenidone and nintedanib have an anti-inflammatory effect as well, and thus can be used in acute phase. Read here COVID-19 pneumonia. This is related to acute exacerbation, and nintedanib once again is known to prevent exacerbation. So up to an extent, it will have some value there as well. So that is something worth considering. I'm not going to dwell much about pirfenidone. Pirfenidone has its logistical difficulties, and therefore I shy away from it because it's too mature, and then it takes about 9 or 12 weeks to start acting. Whereas nintedanib starts maturing on day 1, the dose is 150 BID, easy to administer, and starts working within 4 weeks. So I think if I have to consider this, any antifibrotic in this, it is going to be nintedanib for me. There are few concerns regarding antifibrotics in the acute phase. One of them, some of these COVID patients have hepatic dysfunction in the form of raised transaminases, and both of them can cause hepatotoxicity. There is a little bit of increased risk of bleeding, as most of the COVID patients are on some blood thinner or not. And therefore, I would make sure that I'm careful when I'm dealing with these two things together. So far, we have not seen excessive bleeding, but one has to be cautious. When we are doing it, we have to do it with caution. So it's not just a throwing of an antifibrotic at somebody, not at all. It is a judicious, optimum use of a drug which can add a great deal of value. So the message is, once again, you don't have to roll out these agents to everybody, and never think of antifibrotic in isolation, but whenever steroids or other agents which are anti-inflammatory and even blood thinners, because vasculopathy related lung involvement is also common in patients in the early phases. So one has to be careful that you are putting these people on these agents as well. The last part of this, my argument is that maybe we will just cause a 10% extra lung made available to these patients who already have gone through, say, 2 months of non-invasive ventilation and HFNC, and the CT scores were 18, 20, 22, something like that. And they are very, very gradually. One of my patients after 2 months is on an NRBM and with 5 liters of oxygen, and we are thinking of sending him home on oxygen. We've sent quite a few of these patients are home, and this person can't go home without oxygen, antifibrotic else also. At the end of 6 months, if I may say, 10% of the lung for this particular gentleman, if I'm discharging tomorrow on oxygen, and it may mean at least 5 extra years of life to that particular person towards the end of his life. And therefore, I hope I have convinced you enough that the antifibrotic chosen judiciously, used optimally, taking all the precautions, monitoring the liver function, making sure that you are not using it around blood thinners in an indiscriminate way, will go a long, long way in saving lungs for some small number of these patients. Let me tell you, it is not for everybody again and again. With that, I take your leave. Thank you. And I hope I have convinced you through for using antibiotics. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, both the speakers, Dr. Nitin Abhyankar and Professor Chabra. You both made very compelling arguments, both in favor and against the use of antifibrotics. So, I would like to welcome Dr. Abhyankar for another 5 minutes of rebuttal and to make extra points.
Yeah. Thank you, madam. I'll make a valiant attempt of, trying it on my feet, thinking about what Dr. Chabra said in his talk, because I have the opportunity of listening to his talk beforehand. So I'll try and put in a rebuttal across. I absolutely 100% agree with Dr. Chabra that this is not a universal phenomenon. It occurs in a very, very, very small subset of patients. But when it occurs, then turning a blind eye to it, thinking that it is going to improve, and predicting that it is going to become better after 1 month. Dr. Chabra has beautifully shown 1 month away scans, and it looks very convincing. I have shown you at least 3 cases which have gone more than 3 months, and the case which I showed you was nearly 8 months. And look at that kind of a situation where the person is on oxygen 6 months down the line after recovering from a not so bad hey. I've also had recoveries. I mean, just as Dr. Chabra very beautifully said, a lot of people with a very severe diffuse alveolar damage might just dramatically improve. We have a 36-year-old person who was intubated, ventilated, pruned 7 occasions. He recovered within 1 month, and his lung function at the end of 1 month is brilliant and absolutely normal. I am not going to give him antifibrotics. This is not the kind of antifibrotic usage that I'm proposing. What I am proposing is we need to find out and look at the denominator. We have 30 lakh deaths. We have a few crore people who are infected and a few crore who are going to be infected. Many of them are going to be in the hospitals and ICUs. At this point in time, my ICU is chock-a-block full with 30 patients. Most of them, at least 7 of them are on invasive ventilation. Remaining 15, 20 are on non-invasive ventilation. Many of them are there for a long haul. When they are recovering, and when they are recovering inadequately, extremely slowly and improperly, I am not going to wait for 3 months before a guideline comes up, because the guideline I'm sure will come after 2 to 5 years. No textbooks are written 5 years in advance. The clinical experience emerges. Clinicians on the ground learn a few things. Then they go on various consensus statements. Trials are generated, trials are underway, but the results will not be out. So the guidelines for SARS or MERS would emerge today. They will, the COVID-19 should be, the SARS-CoV-19, the guidelines will not be there available for today. And the evidence that we are looking for, what kind of evidence are we really talking about? Even in case of remdesivir, we talk of remdesivir as a great antiviral. Where do we put it? The evidence tells us to put it in a logically most incorrect way. Very frankly, of course, this slight deviation, but allow me half a minute on that. We are talking of an antiviral, which should be started with the onset of fever, because as we know, most antivirals work beautifully well when there is a viremia. we are giving an antiviral when, as per the CDC recommendation, beyond 8 to 10 days, you are not supposed to isolate the patient anymore. The patient is no more infective to others, but is a candidate for remdesivir. That is the kind of evidence that we are dealing with. And this is the kind of guidelines that we are having at this point in time. Is it a logical guideline to have? I don't think. I am not in complete agreement with that. But leave aside that point. I am not saying that remdesivir is wrong. I am using it in my patients. Majority of my patients receive remdesivir. That's a different story altogether, because we are following the mainstream. But I do strongly think that even in the mainstream, there is a place, a small place, for using antifibrotics in select patients when they fully warrant the typical story which we have seen year after year in various forms of progressive fibrosing interstitial lung disease. When we say progressive fibrosing interstitial lung disease, it encompasses a whole lot of etiologies. And why COVID should be an exception to it, just because I am anticipating improvement. I am anticipating improvement in 99% of the patient. All right. What about the 1% patient? And 1% patients out of 30 lakhs deaths, or for example, say, let us take a denominator of what, 15 crore people in a, what is that number? A huge number. We're not talking of a very small number at all. These people turning into respiratory cripples, where we are eventually, after 2 years, told that you should be using an antifibrotic when you see a particular pattern. That evidence may emerge, may not emerge. I don't know what the story will be. I am sure that this is the first ever virus that we have seen which is involving the vascular structure also. We don't have a target at this point in time. So we are also playing with antithrombotics, and we are playing with antithrombotics without guide. Let us say that Clexane or low molecular weight heparin is the only one which is approved in the acute phase. But many of us clinicians are forced, or rather, I have been surprised by the number of thrombotic events in my own practice. Being a pulmonologist, I am not supposed to receive them, but I keep on receiving surprises, and therefore, a blood thinner or a molecule like rivaroxaban or dabigatran may be continued in some patients if there is a relevant thrombotic process perceived. Difficult to perceive without evidence. It is most difficult to measure. But one measurable entity that we have is 6-minute walk distance. It correlates brilliantly with DLCO. I have seen DLCOs which are, I have shown you the worst possibly 26, but the range in the severe cases which I have seen is DLCO between 26 and 45%. Once again, DLCO low does not mean the antifibrotic is indicated. Possibly steroids are also indicated. But if I am going to give steroids for these patients for a sufficiently long duration of 6 months, am I not submitting to the idea that this process is extensive? This process is going to leave certain amount of scarring, and if my anti-scarring agents are likely to work, will I not offer them a benefit of doubt, which is possibly one of the least harmful agents that I am able to offer? I am using steroids. I am using itolizumab as well. I'm sorry, itolizumab not that common. Tocilizumab. I am causing mucormycosis. I am dealing debridement with the mucormycosis. I am ready to accept the tremendous fluctuations in the sugars that are there in diabetics, but I am not ready to accept an innocuous drug like antifibrotic, which will sit there in the background, and you will have time to think about it after 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 5 months, 6 months. At any time you feel like you can happily discard it. I am not saying that majority of these patients will actually land up into a progressive interstitial lung disease, not at all. This is a one-time hit, as Dr. Chabra brilliantly said. It's a one-time hit. And it is a one-time hit which is expected to recover over a period of time. My job is to make that healing a little more easy for the patient. Let's come to the autopsy series. And Pollock's autopsy series is one of the brilliant autopsy series. And we look at 131 patients. 17 of them actually underwent a lung transplant. A horribly expensive thing like lung transplant is being tried. 10 of lung transplants have been attempted in this country. And what kind of survival we have talked about? 2 out of 10, maybe 2 out of 10. I don't know. I don't remember exactly how many are really alive after 3 months. But this kind of surgery has been undertaken. And 17 of these were post-mortem studies coming from the explant or post-mortem. Most of those people, as Pollock has said, they have died actually. So there are hardly any survivors despite an attempted transplantation. Now, what I am trying to say here is that you are dealing with a very, very severe disease. That severe disease is associated with very poor outcome. 88% of them will have diffuse alveolar damage. That has been shown, very well documented. 59% of them will have a microvascular thrombi. This is the study from Pollock, and it's one of the most brilliant studies on the postmortem. 22% of them had lung fibrosis when they were dead. Now, am I not taking 22% as a number because 88% looks more impressive? I don't think that's the right approach. I am not going to shut my eyes to the idea that there may be a fibrosis. There may be an important element of fibrosis which I have a drug to treat. For example, for vascular microthrombi, I don't have a targeted drug. I really don't have that kind of a drug. But if I have a drug which works on the fibrosis, and the fibrosis can be established by documentation, then I'm on with it. Another thing I think which we have to remember is in this particular entity, what we are seeing is a lymphocytic alveolitis rather than neutrophilic alveolitis. What it means in the terms of whether an antifibrotic will work or not, once again, I'm not able to tell you. But we are seeing a different virus, different disease. So I am not ready to accept the idea that what happened with H1N1, what happened with SARS, what happened with MERS has to match with COVID-19. So once again, I think we are assuming too much there. Just as we are assuming that antifibrotics will work in all patients, no, they may not work. And we have the ability to dissect it out as clinicians on the follow-up. The most important part, which seems to be missing from my senior Dr. Sir's, my opponent, I wouldn't call him my opponent, he's my guru. But at the same time, what seems to be missing is follow-up. We have only shown one follow-up, and some of these patients are lost to follow-up. We are following at least 40 patients for last nearly 6 months. And almost all of them are stagnated at around FVC of around 60%. It's impossible to know what was their FVC to start with. Their total lung capacities are stuck at around 60%. The best I have achieved after everything is around 60%. I have no idea what we started with, so I don't know how much we lost. I have no idea how much really an anti-fibrotic drug contributed to this 60% what is left. But at the same time, am I in a position to make up a choice and play God to the idea that, look, I am not going to give you anti-fibrotic because majority of my patients are doing well. I think it is the story where the argument goes like this. One of the senior doctors from Latur area came to me and said, what are you doing about this bronchoscopy? Why do you need the evidence and why do you need a bronchoscopic lavage to document tuberculosis? I have diagnosed 80% of my patients with a clinical picture alone, and 80% of the times I was right. But what about the remaining 20%? Because we are not talking of majority. We are talking of a small minority of these patients, a small subset of these patients who fully clinically qualify for using and receiving an antifibrotic are left miserable if it is not used, or may be reducing or recovering much more slowly if an antifibrotic is not used. I am ready to throw this concept out of window after 1 year or 2 years. I have no problem with that, because just as we have thrown out hydroxychloroquine from our armamentarium, which was a part of the guideline, we religiously wrote it. I myself took hydroxychloroquine when I had COVID, and I have thrown it out of the window because there is no evidence. The evidence will emerge over a period of time. At this point in time, I will encourage and plead to give everybody who really truly qualifies. I'm not telling you again to go all out and load everybody with Nintedanib, which has been done by, the CT score of 6 or 7, everybody gets a Nintedanib or everybody gets a Pirfenidone. That's not my proposal at all. My proposal is for select subset of patients who really truly qualify clinically and should be getting an antifibrotic, should get an antifibrotic as a benefit of doubt. I would offer them a strong benefit of doubt and wait for the data to emerge. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you. And thank you, sir. That's over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Abhyankar. And
one small point. Just one small point.
Sure, Professor Chabra, please go on.
Dr. Nitin, I love the intensity of your conviction. And your idea is a hypothesis building. Surely the kind of care that you can take in selecting patients for nintedanib in those who have just recovered from the acute phase, that is only you can do that. So the whole purpose of such thinking is to act as hypothesis building. So we should take these patients into a clinical trial mode rather than advocate that we start using. And my objection is not with the use of antifibrotics, but to promote it without going through the scientific rigor that is required to establish it.
Sure.
That is the point. It's a hypothesis building. I mean, that is how the science progresses.
Point well taken, sir. Sure.
Thank you for that, Dr. Chabra. I think we have a lot of viewers and a lot of questions have been asked. Some of them, as expected, are on questions such as when to start antifibrotics, on whom to start antifibrotics, and for how long, which I'm sure has been adequately answered by our speakers, and when not to use as well. But just for the sake of clarifying some of the points, I'm going to ask a few questions. To start with, a question by Dr. Naeem Dar from Srinagar, who asks, again, how long would you give antifibrotics in post-COVID sequelae, and whether pulmonary function tests and HRCT have a role in deciding the duration? Dr. Abhyankar had spoken about it, but if you could just summarize in a few words.
I'll just summarize, what we are doing right now. We have a patient pool of at least 40 patients who are on this follow-up trail. And their follow-up trails, we have essentially chosen very severe disease. And most of these lung functions start at around 40% and they optimize at around 60%. That is the FVC values that I'm talking about. Or if you look at the total lung values. We have also started getting a post-COVID obstructive airway, which is sometimes confusing, and a lot of air traffic also we are seeing. So once we started following a lot of RVTLCs, we started getting a surprise raised RV also. That is besides the point. That's more amenable therapy, more amenable to the bronchodilator therapy and inhaled corticosteroids. So that's not the problem. The problem area is how long to continue with these patients on this. The simplest strategy that I have is I wait for the patients to be on steroid. The steroid has to completely come off. And what it means is generally their desaturation and their DLCA values are at least optimized to 50%, 55%. If that is where they come to. Say somebody starts with 26% and comes to around 50%. If the 50% DLCA value is not desaturating anymore on 6-minute walk distance, his steroid generally can be tapered off if the CT has improved adequately. And then what I do is I follow the FVC trail for about 3 months, and the FVC trail, which is static, it's no more improving, and the CT scan is no more improving, or is not showing more curatable or treatable traits in them. But I mean, the more treatable traits, if at all you ask me, they come more emerge from the alveolitis rather than the fibrotic process. And fibrotic process possibly is only maybe 5 or 10% correctable. But I still will feel that up to around 3 months of static nature of FVC and a total lung capacity is what is required, and a reasonably preserved 6-minute walk distance and no desaturation are good endpoints where we could say, okay, now we don't need therapy anymore. Steroids can be taken off in a good time, and antifibrotics also can be taken off in a good time. Occasional patient like this one which I presented, he has gone on for about 7 or 8 months with both steroids, and steroids are also still being tapered, and an antibiotic is also continued. Maybe 9 months is what his endpoint will be. If he reaches a static phase at that point in stage, I don't foresee more than 9 months exceptionally, because as Dr. Chabra very well pointed out, we are not, unless until there is a trigger for a progressive lung fibrosis, the antifibrotics will cease to be of relevance once you reach a static FVC.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much, Dr. Abhyankar. Professor Chabra, I do understand, take your points that we need strong clinical trials and guidelines to use this on a wide basis. I would like to ask you, what other modalities do you use in improving the lung functions of patients who come with post-COVID sequelae, such as pulmonary rehabilitation or...
Very good question.
In patients who have been followed up, and we have followed up patients for about 6 months with documented lung function, invariably they improve. And the modalities that we have used are largely supportive. Pulmonary rehabilitation is one that works beautifully. We are not pushing steroids beyond a point. So once the patient's CRP becomes normal and the patient is symptomatically better, so there is no point in pushing steroids because the inflammation would go away after some time. It's not a persistent inflammatory lung disease. Neither it's a progressive fibrosing lung disease. So there's no point in pushing steroids beyond 4 to 6 weeks maximum. That is what we have done. Majority of patients have come off oxygen, and there are very few who are continuing on oxygen. So overall, the disease, if it doesn't cause mortality in the acute phase, it carries a very good prognosis. Patients are left with mild lung function abnormalities. So there will be diffusion impairment, a reduction in FVC, but that is clinically not very significant. They have some impairment of exercise capacity, poor quality of life, which would have a psychological component also. That's a broader area how we tackle these patients. These patients also require counseling for that. So basically, supportive treatment that largely works after the initial acute phases.
Sure. Okay. That certainly makes sense and needs to be incorporated in most practices from now on, because in the future we are going to see a number of patients who would require pulmonary rehabilitation, counseling, and it has to be an integrated practice.
We work with the ICU very closely, and I practically take rounds daily. So what we are doing, Dr. Chabra's point is very well taken. We are practicing it very aggressively, very early on, even on non-invasive ventilation. The physiotherapy and the breathing exercises start as early as that. So the rehabilitation counseling has to be extremely intensive in these patients, and we have to prepare them for a long haul. Those who are coming out very slowly, you have to prepare them for a long haul. Yeah, absolutely. And that is a brilliant point, what you make, sir.
And we have designed home care programs, because it's almost impossible for patients to come for supervised rehabilitation.
So by the time they leave, sir, they leave with a lot of educations which are offered right from the word go ICU also. We are not, stopping the physiotherapists in the first few months were afraid to come into the ICU. Now they are absolutely gung-ho about, that you have to sit, that you have to walk, that you have to do this, that you have to raise your arms, do the upper body, all that is being done very aggressively by our physiotherapy team in the ICU.
And for the severe patients, there's basically a lifestyle modification that's required. So they have comorbidities which require attention. So they have to change their lives to control their diabetes better, lose weight. That is very important for these patients.
Yeah.
And regular follow-up, of course, and vaccinations.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. I think I'll take another question. I'm going to combine a couple of questions. Dr. Naeem Dar and Dr. Rajesh Binyala, Dr. Pandey. They've all asked, what is the preference over pirfenidone over nintedanib? Which drug would you prefer, if at all you're going to start antifibrotics? And another question of whether you would combine, whether you would give them a dual antifibrotic, if at all. So this question is to Dr. Neena Abhyankar, obviously.
Yeah, I think Chavra sir not really using them in a big way. Something. I am the bad guy out here. So, all right. I think I'll and let me not take sides. Pirfenidone and nintedanib are equally effective antifibrotics in their own way. Now there are small nuances in their selection choices, and the most logical nuance there is the dosing pattern. The dosing pattern with pirfenidone typically starts with a relatively low dose and matures over a period of 4 weeks. So you have lost valuable 4 weeks in getting to the correct dose. After that, it starts acting after 8 to 12 weeks after a full dose is optimized. That means we have probably lost up to around 3 or 4 months before their pirfenidone really kicks into the action. Comparatively, nintedanib starts acting within 4 weeks, and there is no dose ramping. In fact, you could come down on a dose if there are loose motions, but you don't have to do dose ramping. So there is no need of dose ramping. All we have to do is start with 150 milligram twice daily. So it becomes logical choice. Nintedanib is approved in progressive fibrosing interstitial lung disease. I agree that this is not progressive fibrosing interstitial disease, but if there is enough fibrosis and as an antifibrotic, apart from IPF, pirfenidone is not approved in any other indication by FDAs. Whereas nintedanib is approved in progressive fibrosing interstitial lung disease, so nintedanib probably becomes a next best choice in that scenario. So I think, or rather the first in that scenario, and pirfenidone takes the second place. One has to be careful when you are using it around blood thinners, and therefore very early on, if you are within the first 2 weeks, be extremely careful when there are blood thinners on. Once the blood thinners go away, if you are not having D-dimers which are flying over 10,000s and whatnot, and they have come down to reasonable less than 1,000, and you are able to discontinue blood thinners, most of the times, nintedanib can be safely utilized. So
one more point in favor of nintedanib, may I add, is that if it is not tolerated, it sends that signal pretty early. Pirfenidone does not that. Some patients do not tolerate it because of diarrhea, and that signal comes very early. So you can take action. The side effects of pirfenidone will take a lot of time to manifest.
And last but not the least, another thing which is with nintedanib, another thing which has been documented, because some of the follow-up studies have shown that people who are actually shown to be declining over a period of time tend to improve. So that data again stays with only nintedanib. It is not so much so with pirfenidone. So people who are having worse I'm talking about IPF scenario. The data on IPF scenarios has shown that people who are actually worsening, dwindling, they are put on nintedanib, and over a period of time, whether they are on pirfenidone or nintedanib, over a period of time, they tend to be acting, and over a period of time, the patient stabilizes and re-improves. So we have some extra mileage there for nintedanib. Therefore, nintedanib becomes the choice of drug of choice.
Okay, sir. So I've got another question. Dr. Arun from Chennai is asking, if we are not able to taper the FiO2 on a patient on CPAP, obviously this is in the acute situation, would introducing nintedanib or any antifibrotic be helpful at this stage?
I actually showed you a newspaper article coming from Army Hospital in Pune, and they had put patients on ventilator, non-invasive ventilation, not even HFNC. And so I would look at, it's not going to be just an FiO2. FiO2 cannot be the decider of this. The decider will be, in my mind, are we thinking of alveolitis as a dominant feature, and is that alveolitis progressive? Am I anticipating this patient will go on invasive ventilation within the next 2-3 days? Then I will think of other anti-inflammatory agents, for example, tocilizumab, Ectoly, or bacitracin, which is now available. So these are the other options available to you before thinking of an antifibrotic. Antifibrotic becomes relevant when I see a typical pattern, which is so very convincing to me. I have seen, I'm sure all the pulmonologists, esteemed pulmonologists in this group, they have seen enough UIP. They have seen enough traction bronchiectasis. They have seen emerging honeycombing. They have seen what it means to identify a progressive interstitial lung disease. And if I see a manifestation which is similar to that, I'm sure we are not talking about this being a progressive disease, but those manifestations talk of a relatively poorer prognosis. And if I am going to go on a long haul with this patient for either oxygen therapy or NIV or whatever that supportive therapy is going to be very long. In that case, if I anticipate this patient is going to go beyond 3 months, I would put it on at the end of second. And that would be the cutoff point which I will look at. Now that cutoff point can be staged to the 3rd week, 4th week, depending on individual preferences and experiences. And I'm not saying mine is correct because it's not proven by any science. Sorry.
I think Professor Chabra wants to make a point here. So please go ahead, sir.
In the acute phase and his FiO2 is not coming down, then that's cytokine storms has to be investigated. I don't think the antifibrotics will work wonders here. Here the decision is on the use of tocilizumab or go on to mechanical ventilation or ECMO. These are because this is an intensive care management of patient. Very adding antifibrotics to reduce FiO2 as the primary objective.
Absolutely.
Here it's the question of tackling the inflammatory part.
Sure, sir. Another question for you, Professor Chabra. This is from Bhopal, Dr. Anil Kapoor. So this, I think, with or without antifibrotics, how frequently would you do the CT chest and lung function test while monitoring lung recovery in post-COVID fibrosis?
First spirometry is at 1 month. The second is at 3 months. Then it could be at 3 to 6 monthly intervals. That was spirometry. And diffusion capacity is at 6 months and 12 months. So this is the lung function protocol follow-up. CT, I do one CT during the acute phase, then one month later to see what is the acute reversal, and then the stability at around 6 months. After that, it will be on a case-to-case basis. So there's no regular CT protocol for follow-up beyond 6 months.
I think what we are doing is slightly different because we have a much worse subset of patients who are being on a follow-up, and therefore our spirometries are being done monthly. Whenever the patient is showing us 2 consecutive spirometries which are stable, then we repeat one more at the end of 1 month, and then if I find that the patient is just not improving, then we don't do it. Then we just repeat 6-minute walk distance or DLC or only single parameters where I'm expecting improvement. Only that gets followed up. So initial evaluation, we do everything for everybody, and follow-up will involve certain select subset of those cases where I'm expecting improvement. And if I stop seeing improvement, for example, the FVC just stabilizes after 1 month, 2 consecutive FVCs are stable, then if I'm going to continue for another 2 months, do a spirometry after 2 months. The CT scan, I think, very important point worth mentioning about is that there is a tendency to do a CT scan within a few for the first 2 weeks, and that is going to be dangerous because invariably you will see a worsening, and that will lead to much more. I mean, it's just not on. You have to treat the patient clinically. That worsening which is seen in the first 2 weeks, I have my example to quote because I had a COVID pneumonia. Then the cotton candy kind of an appearance emerged, and it looked much worse after 2 weeks. And at that time, we had no knowledge. We did a CT after 2 weeks after the first one. And that was a little premature. And then when you look at it at the end of 3 months, everything has disappeared. So I think 3 months is possibly the best time to do a follow-up CT when you are about to wind this case up. And for people who really are stuck with a very low lung function, maybe another CT scan at the end of whenever you are about to stop antifibrotic therapy or whatever else.
When is your first CT, Dr. Nitin?
The first CT was day 8 or 9.
Yeah, I thought I got it that in the first 2 weeks you should not do. That is what you said.
Yeah. No. The first CT was after 8 or 10 days of the symptoms. Yes. So that is an appropriate time when the COVID pneumonia emerges. But it tends to worsen, and more often than not, it worsens. Either the innate nature of the disease is such, and plus the fibrosis when it starts setting, it leaves long strands, and those long strands look ghastlier. So in the terms of visually, you are scared to look at those CTs. People get scared that their CT score and of course, the way CT scoring is done is also possibly another debate topic, and you can have much worse pro-con on the way it has been reported, because most of our patients are today being reported when they are non-COVID also they are reported. CT score is reported as 5 or 6, and then they come to us and said, "Abhi ye kyun aaya yahan par? Is it 6 is my CT score? So do I have COVID?" So the whole argument goes into a completely different zone out.
The problem which has emerged is people are getting CT done on day 1 and day 2, which is not showing anything.
Absolutely.
And later on.
And day 1 is the most silliest time to do it. And then they are in the false sense of security that they have a mild disease.
Absolutely. I think you both made very valid arguments that we are all facing on a daily basis, trying to convince patients, and, basically it needs a lot of counseling, hand-holding, and trying to walk them through the pathway when they come to us for consultations as to what needs to be done when mild cases, moderate and severe. So, yeah, definitely. So we were talking about our experience or information gathered from the MERS and the SARS-1. So here's a question which basically Surya Prakash from Noida is asking. Can we develop a definite score-based criteria for the use of antifibrotics? Because the earlier studies were fewer in number. And now with the first wave and the second wave, we have a large number of patients, a large amount of data. So can we start to put things together to see if we can have a score-based criteria as to who would benefit and who do not need it?
You see, if we are thinking in terms of a scoring system, definitely it has to be, but again, like I said, it has to be in a clinical trial mode. Otherwise it won't work. So we have to define the inclusion criteria, the exclusion criteria, and that is where the scoring system would come in. And usually it's a multimodal kind of criteria, which includes not only the CT picture, but also the clinical aspects as well as the inflammatory markers. So that is a kind of composite score which I haven't seen any so far. Although worldwide there are millions and millions of patients, but
there's no score like that.
There's no score.
And the worst difficulty is the blind zone of vascular involvement. Because I have seen in a COVID fibrosis, a very big pulmonary embolism making the matter much worse. And the patient getting into an ICU, staying there for about 7 days, and then eventually coming out and then continuing to recover. Now, if I have a microvascular thrombi or microthrombi, vascular microthrombi, that is one entity. But if I get a proper big pulmonary embolism superimposed on it, that even becomes more difficult to generating even a good CT, some kind of a scoring system will be very, very difficult in the clinical context. Because how will you measure a vascular involvement without any knowledge about which vessels are involved? Where are they really?
Problem with vascular involvement is largely distal. So in fact, the pulmonary angio doesn't pick it up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I mean, I talked about a case where there was a direct, right main complete involvement. That's a different story. But the microthrombi are non-measurable. How do we get a handle onto them? Where do we put them? And what is the significance to them, basically?
So, following on from the same question, same point we talked about, there is Dr. Paresh Chandra Mohanta and others who have asked whether a CT scan severity score, either at baseline or on a follow-up, would help in deciding who would actually benefit from an antifibrotic.
I think the simple answer is no. Because I have seen a CT score of 23, patient walking in the wards, helping everybody else. He became a volunteer. And with that 23, we admitted him in ICU, kept him there for a day. He did not require even oxygen.
The problem is
what about the follow-up CT, Dr.
The problem of CT score is that it's based on the area involvement rather than quality of the involvement.
Exactly.
So ground glass will also get the same marks and consolidation will also get the same mark.
So pattern recognition is more critical rather than CT score. So pattern recognition is
ground glass specification giving you a score of 20, but patient has no hypoxia.
Absolutely, no hypoxia, nothing whatsoever. In fact, he became our volunteer for 15 days because we had to keep him as per the regulation at that time for 15 days inside the hospital.
These scores have never been validated. These came very early in March and April. There's one scoring system of out of 40, 1 out of 25, and they have never been validated.
Absolutely. So, in fact, whatever trials we are generating related to, we are doing 3 trials. We have not really used the CT scoring as the baseline criteria for anything. At the most, we are noticing it and recording it, but we are saying pattern recognition is more important. Definitely.
Sure. Thank you both very much. I'm just trying to get through another couple of questions at least when we have the time. Dr. Jeet Singh from Maharashtra is asking whether just oxygen therapy at home and for how long, others have asked, would that help in resolving the post-COVID fibrosis or improving lung functions?
The oxygen therapy is given for a different purpose. It is to maintain oxygen homeostasis. And as long as patient is desaturating or at rest, he requires oxygen. Absolutely. And once resting oxygen comes up and then on exercise also is not desaturating, then it's time to discontinue oxygen. Oxygen is not going to in any way affect the degree of fibrosis or its reversal.
If at all, of course, we are not going to use hyperoxia kind of damage, but if at all, oxygen could cause damage there if used excessive. In fact, in the ICUs today, our algorithms are now targeting 93 to 95% saturation rather than 99 or 100. No. That is true for ARDS also, and that is true for
harmful. Anything above 96 is harmful.
Absolutely.
Sir, just a question from my side. People who are on the dual onslaught of the COVID viremia, as well as who are on mechanical ventilator, the lung damage due to the mechanical ventilator, would those be the criteria that you would think of to qualify for antifibrotics? Would that be a subset of patients?
That question is confused. Very frankly, when I have viremia, I generally am not on ventilator. And with viremia, I am in the community. I am spreading it to others.
Sure, patients with COVID.
We don't measure viremia at any point in COVID.
Yeah.
We only measure degree of inflammation and the degree of deterioration clinically. If the patient is on mechanical ventilation, then the issue is to give rest to the lung and help in its recovery. So the purpose of mechanical ventilation is to support, and these patients, because they have ARDS, fortunately, a lot of these patients have a good compliance, not the standard ARDS where there's a poor compliance.
Yes, yes.
So we just protect
That's
the lungs, allow time for supportive therapy to act.
Yeah.
So that is
High
a
length
mechanical ventilation.
This is typically what sir is describing is high elastance kind of
Yes,
ARDS.
yes.
And in that situation, you don't need very high PEEPs, and the ventilatory requirements are modest. FiO2 requirement is the only thing which you have to follow.
In fact, the lung is so fragile, even with this good elastance, that we have lots of pneumothoraces occurring in these patients.
Absolutely, absolutely, because they are over distended
Yes.
because of the conventional ventilation strategies.
Sure, sir. There's one other issue of some reports of smoking being protective in COVID fibrosis.
It's the other
Is
way
there
around.
anything
It's
you would
the
like
other
to
way
talk
around.
about?
Is the other way around. Actually, smoking is one of the high risk factors. Alcohol also is included in that. So please don't. Doctors need not be really enjoying their evening drink because you have to be careful with that. But I think the smoking and alcohol both are included as factors which are likely to make lung damage worse. Both of them. A COVID-related lung damage. There is data on this.
Sure, sir. I think we have covered most of the questions asked by our audience in terms of post-COVID fibrosis. Of course, there are other questions related to antivirals, anticoagulants, and others, and I'm sure we will have further webinars where we can address those questions again. So I think we've had a very interesting discussion and debate with both of you eminent speakers. And
Have a remdesivir debate very soon, because with the kind of shortage that we have of remdesivir, we really need to put it in a very realistic place where it really.
I like the WHO statement, it's a useless drug.
Absolutely. I agree with you, sir.
yeah. So with that, I think we'll have to wind up this debate. Thank you both for your valuable time, and thank you to the organizers, Dr. N.H. Krishna, Dr. Narayan Pradeepa, Dr. Ravi Dosia, and the others. We've had a really interesting debate, and I'm sure it has clarified a lot of questions in our pulmonologists' minds, and which may help us carry over the management of post-COVID fibrosis. And I'm sure by in another few months or maybe a year, we'll have a lot of data. We should all start looking towards collecting data, starting some clinical trials, which may help in the future of, because it looks like we are going to be cohabiting with COVID-19.
This looks like a long haul thing.
Yeah, we are in for the long haul, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. We need evidence-based medicine, and yeah, so I think we should all start working towards that. So thank you both for your valuable time and excellent talk about pro and cons of antifibrotics.
Enjoyed very much. Thank you, Dr. Kiran. Thank you, Nitin.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. My privilege, sir.
Right.
I am honored to be in front of this, sir.
My pleasure too. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you.